It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, in this segment, no exception. We are very excited to have with us our guest, Rabbi Susan Silverman, an interesting, really deep new work called Casting Lots, Creating a Family in a Beautiful Broken World. It should be an interesting discussion indeed. Again, Susan Silverman is a Reformed rabbi, author, and activist, and she, along with her husband, penned Jewish life or Jewish family and life, traditions, holidays, and values for today's parents and children. She's written for and appeared in the Forward, the Boston Globe, New York Times, the Daily Beast, Huffington Post, the Jerusalem Post, the New York Post, etc., etc. She also partners with her sister, comedian actress Sarah Silverman, on lectures and panels to address issues they are very, very passionate about. We are pleased to have her. Susan, how are you, my friend?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, we are very pleased to have you here. The title alone, Casting Lots, Creating a Family in a Beautiful Broken World. A little bit of a double-edged sword there. Share with us, if you would, the journey, at least the highlights, at least, and we'll get into detail, that led you to this work.
So, well, really what led me to this work is my family. You know, I'm a rabbi, but really what led me to write this book was the fact that, you know, we have 5 kids, 3 biological and 2 adopted. And when we adopted our older child, as I say, like our boys are adopted and our girls are biological. So I say we produce girls and import boys. But when we had our older son came home, I just started kind of like looking at the world differently. Like here was this child who had come from, he was only in our family because of tragedy, you know, because of lack of opportunity, because of poverty, because of disease, because of all of these things that sort of combined to make it impossible for a woman to raise the child she gave birth to. He became ours, but his becoming ours was so joyful, so beautiful, so amazing for us. And that juxtaposition of such tragedy and such joy really made me think that, wow, adoption is sort of a microcosm of God's world, you know, where all of these contradictions exist in one world together, and that's true for adoption as well.
Was it a difficult decision having biological children? Was it a difficult decision, or what brought you to that decision to adopt?
I knew I wanted to adopt since I was a kid. My mom, you know, has always told me stories of being like 9 years old and saying that when I grew up, I was going to adopt kids. We, in our family, my parents had a couple of girls who were foster kids live with us over a number of years. And I couldn't believe that there were kids in the world who didn't have their own families. And I just knew from a young age that I wanted to adopt. It was really having biological kids on top of that was sort of the new thing for me. And so it was just always clear. It was just a question of when.
I've got a question for you, because I know you counsel and work with lots of people. As I look at your picture on the sleeve of the cover of this book, you are way younger than I am. But I'm going to guess you're going to remember when American families tried to adopt American Caucasian families tried very hard to adopt Caucasian children. Mm-hmm. In my opinion and in my experience, even living in the Midwest, that has changed dramatically, and multicultural families are becoming very much commonplace. And I'm wondering if you've noticed the same thing, and if you had some thoughts about that one way or the other. That the adoptions are not necessarily Anglo children. They may very well come from Korea, or they may come from Thailand. They may come from.
That's right.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, absolutely. Listen, there are 153 million orphans in the world. 8 to 12 million kids in institutions alone. Most of these kids do not have any hope of being reunited with any biological family. And so what it means if you're an orphan is that you are uniquely vulnerable to sex trafficking, to other kinds of criminal trafficking, to horrible labor conditions, to illness and to death. So I'm not at all concerned with the question of race. I'm concerned with the question of kids getting to families. So if it's mostly Anglo people who are adopting and a lot of brown kids who are being adopted, so be it. I mean, just want to get kids out of this high-risk situation and into permanent loving families where they can just grow into their full humanity. But I think also one of the things that you point to about, white parents looking for white, infants, that's a question of people adopting because I think largely because of infertility, which is a perfectly good reason to adopt. But what I'm more interested in than adults becoming parents is I'm interested in kids getting families. And that's where my orientation is. It's like, how do we get all these kids into families? And that's something that's not so much concerned with race or ethnicity, but with just getting kids, into a place of lots of love and focus.
Yeah, it would also seem to me that the entire environment for adoption is much more open. The conversations are much more candid. There's much more transparency, and that has to be nothing but a good thing, I would think.
I completely agree. What
about, and again, where does your role as rabbi, how does that affect either A, how did it affect your view of adoption, your view of family, and how does it affect you maybe when you either counsel people or offer advice?
Well, being a rabbi and being Jewish means that the way that I orient myself in the world are with, the Jewish paradigms and Jewish metaphors and Jewish rituals and a sense of Jewish history. And so that informs the way I think about my life and my world. So, for example, when my son first came home, and I spent a lot of time thinking about his birth mother, who was she, what was her story, and feeling just kind of heartbroken. And I looked at texts, and in the story of the creation of the world, God, which I don't take literally, but I see these all as metaphors and ways to orient ourselves in the world. God creates the world by separating the upper waters from the lower waters and making sky and oceans, essentially. And in that separation, the rabbis teach that the waters wept. The waters wept at being separated, the upper waters becoming sky and the lower waters becoming the waters of the earth. And I thought, wow, loss is kind of like primal loss is what creation is made of. It's just a part of the world. And my son made it so that was surfaced for me. That was made, obvious in my life in a way that, for a lot of people or for me and most of my life, it was not obvious.
Do you find that, what about, let's focus for just a second. Again, by the way, if you just joined us, we're talking to Susan Silverman. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Brand new work, a very, very fascinating work called Casting Lots, Creating a Family in a Beautiful Broken World. Well put. Herself, the mother of biological children and adopted children, so to speak. Ultimately, they are children in the Silverman family. But Susan, I'm curious as to when you look to a younger generation, the millennials, so to speak, when you talk to them, they're certainly getting married later. Their view of family in the traditional Western sort of historical view is much more varied, much more broad and open. Does that in any way, shape, or form affect their views on adoption, do you think?
I think there's a lot, it's in our world, it's postmodern, and everything is sort of relative. And I think that sort of makes adoption a lot more kind of acceptable, easy. There's so many people who've adopted from people my age and younger, I think largely because certainly in the Jewish community where people marry later and try to get pregnant later, oftentimes like build their families through adoption. And I think that it's something really common. I mean, I don't think my kids, they know other adopted kids. It's kind of normal. Nobody like really looks at us strangely. I think it's become a very normal thing in the U.S. for sure, and in Israel as well.
What about and again, you mentioned Israel. Let's talk about Europe. Let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about the Far East and Asia. What do you sense around the world about as far as the attitudes on adoption and their view towards it? Maybe that's too big of a question for right now.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Listen. I went just because it is big, but also because it's a very painful kind of sweeping attitude, I think, often in the world, which is that there's this international, based on policies, and UNICEF, even Save the Children, these policies and in various countries really, really prioritize keeping kids in their birth countries. And what that often means is that kids don't have families. So we're prioritizing this kind of like DNA, like obligation to carry on a heritage over permanent loving families. And for millions of girls, it's meaning sex trafficking. For millions of boys, it's meaning different kinds of criminal and you know, essentially slavery. And we're really sacrificing kids on the altar of this ideal, of this, you know, I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, but there's this kind of like ironically liberal ideal that like we are obligated by our DNA, which we would never say for adults, by the way. Like we would never say to like a gay Iranian man, like, oh, don't leave Iran. You know, it's your culture. You should be beheaded. You know, like we would try to help that person. But when it's children, we hold them hostage to this like idea of like heritage, a sort of like romantic idea of heritage, you know, that we can't like colonize essentially these children by taking them out of their heritage and putting them into like, you know, Western developed so-called nations, you know, but we're sacrificing them. They are dying. They are being sex traded. Girls are being married at age 12, you know, to people who bought them. Like we're allowing all this to happen to sort of call ourselves clean, you know, of like some sort of like modern colonization. And it's so painful.
You know, in your book, one of the things that you were talking about is one of the adoption forms. And the things you're supposed to be checking off elements that you've had or ones you're willing to have in a child, ranging from clubfoot to blindness to spinal bifida to HIV. Curious again, my assumption is, and I don't have any statistics to back it up, but that those that are adopting in the year 2016 have a much more open, maybe enlightened attitude than what they had in 1955.
That's probably true, and also because you know a lot of the things that kids suffer from might be very serious in their birth countries, but they're not going to be necessarily serious things in the U.S. or Israel or someplace like that where there's really, really good medical care. Like, so, for example, our younger son is deaf, right? He's profoundly deaf. But we live in Israel, and so for free, he got 2 cochlear implants, and he lives as a hearing kid. He hears with the cochlear implants. You know, it's a miracle. But if he were in Ethiopia, you know, at age 14, they'd be about to release him to live on his own in the city with no hearing and really no education and no capacity to grow. And as it is now, you know, he's about to run in the Jerusalem Marathon tomorrow. He's you know, an excellent student. He's just super smart, super funny. He's like being able to fully become.
What about, and again, this is, I wanted to talk about the book, but I also want to touch on your organization called Just Adopt. Tell us the essence of that. I can imagine the motivation behind it, but tell us a little bit about the mission, and then let's get into that a little bit.
Sure, that's great. Thank you for the opportunity. So the idea is that I'm approaching churches, synagogues, non-religious organizations. It doesn't matter what it is, a small school, a community center, and teaching about the orphan crisis and about the foster care crisis in the U.S. and saying, okay, this community, let's make that an issue of our community. How many families within your community want to adopt? And once people learn about the need for adoption, people are surprisingly interested in doing it themselves. And so the idea is that we would find maybe, say, for example, a synagogue, 10 or 15 families in some large synagogue that all adopt from the same country or the same orphanage even within that country, or all from the local foster care system in that state in the U.S. And then kids, there's a community, and a kid has a family and they look out and there are 10 other families that look like theirs. And the community, addresses the issues, especially if it's foster care adoptions, like what might be needed to help the kids adjust as positively as possible. How can we integrate into the curriculum of our religious schools the idea of adoption, to normalize it, to integrate, concepts, ideas, metaphors from the kids' home countries. How do we sort of normalize who they are and where they're from in the community, and transforming the whole community in that way? I think really enriching it, the whole community in that way, while giving, a dozen kids permanent loving families in a community.
What about and again, with your work with Just Adopt, what are you finding for the most part a more enlightened, more willing attitude from the families that you talk to adopt and seeing it as a very real option? Or are there still some of the either stereotypes or sort of misinformation maybe that's out there?
So there is a lot of misinformation. I mean, people think that, it has become much harder to adopt from abroad, but where I work with a different organization trying to change that. And I think it will change. I think it will change in a big way before too long. But in terms of foster care kids, there's this real image that is like all really troubled kids, really difficult kids, or violent kids, and it's really not. I mean, there are kids who are really suffering like that, but there are a ton of kids who are just, kind of like typical kids, but who are desperate for a family. And so a lot of education around what's true in the foster care system, a lot of education about what's needed internationally, and to sort of, say, especially for religious communities, what are our priorities? What do we care about? The orphan and the stranger should be the top of the list. So how do we really prioritize that and look outward to the crisis that exists and respond to it in a really meaningful way?
What about, let's take this a little bit global. What are really the real, very real, forget stereotypes, forget the human sort of misconceptions here. What are the functional barriers to adopting internationally?
So the functional barriers, well, it's really slowed in a lot of places. And the causes for the slowing down are a lot of the things that I said before. It's like these attitudes about what it means to send kids abroad internationally. It's, organizations like UNICEF who say, okay, we want to prioritize sustainable life and keeping families together and communities together in the home countries, which is a great goal. But A, there's not been success around that particularly. And B, the number of orphans has increased. And C, the number of kids getting adopted who are orphans has decreased as a result of all of this. So I would say by any stretch, let's not write off work towards sustainability in many countries. That's hugely important. And if I had to choose between that sustainability work and adoption, I would choose that sustainability work because it's crucial. It's moving whole countries forward. But we don't have to choose. We don't have to sacrifice the kids for whom those efforts are just too little too late. We don't have to sacrifice them. They can have full, meaningful lives as somebody's son or daughter, as everybody deserves to be.
Again, as a rabbi, you've got a unique perspective here. Again, we're talking to Susan Silverman. She is a rabbi, lives in Israel, but she has written because you've lived in Israel doesn't mean you can't write a book. She has, in fact, written a book called Casting Lots, Creating a Family in a Beautiful Broken World, about adoption, the plight of children around the world in many respects. What is the role of the modern day church, or a broader question, the modern day religion, and what should the role be of government in any of this? Should they be involved or not?
Wait, should government be involved in religion, or religion involved in government?
Religion involved in adoption in any way, shape, or form to help manifest it, spread the word, and what role, if any, should government play in making these adoptions easier and more possible?
So government we really have to prioritize kids. What we prioritize, in addition to the things that I outlined before, what governments prioritize is keeping their hands clean. So the U.S. State Department, if they feel there's any risk of any kind of corruption at all, they'll just shut down the adoptions, because they don't care about the kids. They care about not having, if there's one instance of corruption, then that relationship with that other country is in a crisis. And that's what they want to avoid. But meanwhile, if you shut down adoption, you can avoid that crisis. But millions of kids are suffering, are getting sick, are dying, are being subjugated. So it's not a worthwhile trade. Like, we have to figure out how to work together as nations, where we're not playing a blame game, but we're all working together to make sure that kids get families. So in terms of religions being involved, I mean, I am not at all interested in anything, regarding saving souls. Like, that doesn't interest me. I want to save bodies. I want children to be loved and taken care of. For me, I'm Jewish. I love being Jewish. I think it's a worthwhile way of making sense of the world, but I don't, it's, to me, the priority for my kids is giving them a permanent loving family. And the way we do family is Jewish. That's secondary. I don't feel like there's I don't feel like we're saving a kid in terms of giving them some sort of religion. I don't think that matters at all. I think the permanent loving family, and however they find meaning in the world, is fine.
Well, it is a subject that has been around for centuries and will be around for centuries, approached uniquely by Rabbi Susan Silverman. The work is called Casting Lots, Creating a Family in a Beautiful Broken World. Susan, how can people find out a little bit more about Just Adopt, as well as maybe pick up a copy of the book?
JustAdopt.net, and the book you can get, hopefully it's at your local bookstore. If it's not, it's on, all of the sites, Amazon.com and Book Depository, anything.
Well, we appreciate very much the work that you do on behalf of children, in some cases around the world. And thank you so much for spending part of your day with us today. And again, would like to have you back again and maybe do some follow-up.
I would love it. You are terrific. Thank you so much.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. Hey, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. You're really terrific. It was really fun.
Good.
Great questions.
All right. Well, great. Take care. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means some Smart Talk radios in your future. And this segment, looking forward to this one. Jesse Jarnow is, he's got a brand new workout called Heads. Subtopic or subheadline is a biography of psychedelic America, and that alone could take hours to talk about, as long as we stay focused. But in the short 30 minutes we have, we'll definitely cover it. Jesse is the author of A Big Day Coming, Yola Tango, and the Rise of Indie Rock. His work has appeared in the London Times, The Village Voice, Rolling Stone, Salon.com, San Francisco Chronicle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lives in Brooklyn, New York. Where else would he live? Well, maybe Northern California. But anyway, very pleased to have him. Jesse, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Yeah, I guess the big question is, how in the world did we make it to 2016?
Very slowly. Something like that.
Well, let's, the discussion of this book and of psychedelic America undoubtedly is also tied to some of the cultural happenings of the time, whether it be the Merry Pranksters or the Grateful Dead or who knows what. But let's do this. Why don't you share with our audience a little bit, if you would, what led you to this particular subject and this particular work?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a story that I've been interested in for a long time. You know, I in high school, you know, I'm in my 30s now. You know, in high school, I discovered the Grateful Dead, and through the Grateful Dead, discovered this whole wider world behind them that folded in all these different topics, and large among them was psychedelics, but it also included, you know, technology and art and politics, and there was this encompassing worldview and history that seemed really apparent to me, that was covered a little bit in books and magazines and, you know, sort of other places, but largely seemed to me to be more like a sort of like a secret history, or kind of like a folk history, kind of all these rumors and myths and things that kind of got, you know, passed down through the years. And at a certain point, I realized that was kind of a large arc narrative in itself that I wanted to know, that I knew bits and pieces of from research and just from hearing things. And I really wanted to assemble that into the big story of how psychedelics and how the psychedelic culture and how the counterculture got from the 60s to the present. You know, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and people often talk about psychedelics and the Grateful Dead as these 60s things. And which is true, you know, that's definitely not inaccurate, but it's a story that's continued really vividly through the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 21st century. And so much of the literature about it really focuses on the 60s, and for good reason. You know, it's a really fascinating period. But I wanted to know what happened after that. I wanted to know how these stories connected onwards, and how, you know, the psychedelic acid tests of the Merry Pranksters in the 60s kind of led to the very early disco parties in New York. You know, that's kind of one thread. Or how Stuart Brand, who is one of the Merry Pranksters, how he founded the Whole Earth Catalog, which then became this really influential document on the early computer culture in Northern California in the early 70s, and how, you know, you can go piece by piece from the Merry Pranksters to the Whole Earth Catalog to Apple computers to all kinds of things. And the story of psychedelics in this country just seemed like a fantastically unifying springboard to talk about this big, slow societal change that they sort of, you know, brought on in this country.
Right, and if you lived it, you watched America grow from a black and white, Leave It to Beaver culture to one that was highly colorized, and the psychedelics in particular. Those, at least for the middle-class suburban kids, that was brand new stuff. Brand new.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and not to be taken lightly either, for that matter. It's something that, I don't want to trivialize them, you know, and, you know, make them, you know, make psychedelics sound like these casual, you know, party drugs or, you know, or things like that. They're pretty serious and dangerous stuff, and have had extremely powerful impacts on people, both positive and negative. And that's something that I wanted to get into as well, because, you know, there are a lot of different shades have been folded into all those technicolors over the 50 years that they've been part of the public dialogue.
What about the relationship, or did you find any relationships between, and again, there undoubtedly there were some, as a matter of fact, I know there were some, but what about the extent, you're talking about the extension of sort of that psychedelic culture, and we'll just peg it for right now in the late 60s, very early 70s, into outgrowths such as Silicon Valley, outgrowths into places like Studio 54 in New York, and all those going from smoking weed to snorting coke off of a mirror is quite a journey in and of itself. But secondarily, what about outgrowth from any of that culture into ultimately the fairly radical student movement with Students for a Democratic Society, the Weathermen, and all that. Did that trail back into there? Or that seems like almost a separate. That political culture seemed completely separate from that.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there were probably my impression, and what I pretty much know to be true, is that a lot of times psychedelics would push people towards radical politics. One thing that psychedelics do is break down preconceptions and break down just sort of things that have been ingrained in people's heads, and political structures are certainly one of those things. So I think there is a pretty strong push from at least in the 60s, from the psychedelic world into sort of the world of radical politics, and I think that thread continues onwards as well. And there's certainly some of that. There are connections to that currently in kind of I guess what you call the anonymous movement, kind of connected to sort of Bitcoin and hacking and things like that. There is a psychedelic thread there as well. But a large part of the psychedelic world is what you'd really call counterculture, or people who, I'll paraphrase because I can't say the exact phrase on the air, but there's a Ken Kesey expression that he used at an anti-war march in 1965, saying that the only thing that you can do to really protest war is to turn your back and say screw it, which is not exactly how he put it, but that became in itself kind of an abiding political philosophy, I think, of the psychedelic counterculture, of people who were fed up with sort of what society was becoming, and that that includes the Vietnam War, but that also includes industrialized food processes, or all these things that sort of take people away from the earth, I guess would be one way to put it. And so in that sense, psychedelics were also a real starting point for a lot of things like home birth movements and organic food, and there were a lot of people who took psychedelics and were inspired to go back to the land and start communes.
Right.
And I mentioned before Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, and that was a really important connection point between sort of this rediscovery of the earthy past of living off the land, but also the future, and kind of using new technology and new discoveries to enable that.
Right. We want to be clear here, too. And again, we're talking to Jesse Jarnow. He is a critic. He's an author first, but he's also been a cultural critic, so to speak. His works appeared in London Times, Village Voice, Rolling Stone, all the usual suspects, so to speak, including the San Francisco Chronicle and elsewhere. Lives in Brooklyn. Jess, I think we also, though, want to be careful, too. This isn't necessarily, it's an exploration, not necessarily a celebration of all things LSD, but, and it's certainly, obviously, you talk to anybody from the musical community and some of the cultural communities and the arts will say that was definitely a part of it. I cannot imagine the value of everybody dropping acid and laying around for 8 or 9 hours. That would not do much, and I don't want to editorialize too much here. That was definitely a part of it. My question is to you is, and let's just use some cultural icons like the Grateful Dead, Peter Max, on and on and on. Some of the cultural, the alternative culture heads at the time. What would they tell you that acid was symptomatic of the times, symptomatic of their desire to explore more, or it just simply accelerated or expanded what they were going to do anyway?
I think it's probably a combination of those two things. I think it's a lot of the latter. I think psychedelics are a lot of what you bring with you. The guys in the Grateful Dead were all pretty committed musicians, and had really studied their craft before they discovered psychedelics. The same goes with Ken Kesey, who became known as a psychedelic novelist, but he had been a real focused writer for a long time. People talk about Hunter S. Thompson as this wild, crazed, druggie, but if Hunter S. Thompson had never discovered psychedelics, he probably would have been writing for the New York Times anyway. So it's really, they're amplifiers. They kind of sort of take things that people were thinking about, emotionally, creatively, any of that, and transform them and give people new perspectives on them, which is why I think they've been so so important in creative arts. I think that's a pretty natural place. But, technology as well, and computer science, any kind of field that requires kind of a big vision creativity, I think that there is that potential and there is that possibility. If somebody is, going in with kind of the right intention, they can be really transformative. And you're right, it's not, the ideal is not everybody taking LSD and lying around 8 or 9 hours a day, that kind of thing. But these things, psychedelics really often get used in people's youth, where there is kind of that period for exploration, where there is kind of, life is kind of open-ended, and you're still trying to kind of figure out exactly how you're going to express yourself in this world, and how all these things are going to come to fruition. And I think it can be really valuable in that part of life, especially before things are too reined in and defined, and kind of sort of college age, I guess, is what I would say.
I don't want to dredge up the old arguments pro and con, but I am curious a little bit in the research you did for this book, Beyond Culture. Did you have any talks at all with anyone in the medical community at all about short-term, long-term effects, good, bad, or indifferent of LSD, and therefore not only understanding the nature of the drug, but also how it might impact the people that used it?
Guess I didn't speak directly with, but there's a huge body of literature about that, and that's something that I did focus on a little bit and did spend some time digging in and researching, and not just LSD, but mushrooms as well. And there's actually an increasingly large body of literature now in the 21st century about the long-term positive effects of things like mushrooms and LSD, in terms of affecting, sort of, I guess, one way they've been used to treat things is, I guess, what's called end-of-life syndrome, which is, the fear of death. And that's something that does have a long-term effect on people who use psychedelics. There's sort of this sense of well-being that can come out of that. And there are papers that have studied, have gone back and surveyed people who spent a significant amount of time with psychedelics in, previous decades, and sort of talked about sort of what psychedelics' place in their lives are now. And it seems like the response is usually, well, I don't do them anymore, but I really value what I got out of them then. One thing that did not come up in any of the scientific literature really in any significant way are, kind of the cliched acid flashbacks, which is, to me, sort of, that it's not that they don't happen, but it's something that I think has become more of a scare tactic than an actual provable, symptom of people who experimented with LSD previously. So yeah, there is a fair bit of literature now in what's called the psychedelic renaissance, talking about sort of more formalized ways to use psychedelics and to sort of improve well-being in various capacities. And that's something that's really fascinating to me, is that it's sort of now that kind of the sort of the scare tactics of the drug war era have started to calm down a little bit. It seems like there's been kind of this new acceptance of psychedelic, of the proper medical worth of psychedelics. There are all these studies going on at like NYU and Johns Hopkins, studying the spiritual effects of psychedelics. That's one big thing that people talk about as a positive influence of psychedelics. There's a lot of people who discovered, Buddhism through psychedelics. There have definitely been a bunch of studies about that, how drug use has become sort of a gateway to spirituality and religion, and the drugs often go by the wayside after that, but the effects of connecting people with larger internal or spiritual forces, I think, is pretty strong.
Yeah. Now, and again, in fairness, so to speak, Jess, let's make sure on the flip of things, You also had incredibly talented people that were very much a part of this. For example, Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Zappa pretty cynical about the whole thing. In some of his stuff, he said, there was a lyric about saying, "I'm a kid. I'm going to go to San Francisco, get the crabs, and sleep on Owsley's floor." The guy that was
right.
producing all the
that song well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Zappa was a big anti-drug guy. And I'm curious as were several very, very talented ones. They were sort of either all in the pool or all out. And were you able to explore any of those? Were there any bands or any of the cultural icons at the time that you were surprised at their drug use?
I'll preface this by saying that obviously psychedelics are not for everybody. They're pretty idiosyncratic things as our people. So it's not like it's not something that everybody needs to do. Zappa, I've been a fan of for a long time, so that it was certainly not a surprise to me to discover that he was anti-drug. One that I came across that did surprise me a little bit recently was Pink Floyd, which when I heard the explanation makes sense. Pink Floyd was legendarily founded by Syd Barrett, who's kind of become known as this famous acid casualty, as sort of the poster boy for the bad things that happen if you take LSD, and certainly what happened to Syd Barrett is not a positive thing necessarily. He had this wildly creative period and then basically fell off the map and went and lived with his mom for the next 30 years and didn't make really any more music. So I read this, somebody asked David Gilmour from Pink Floyd about their drug use. And his response was, well, I experimented with acid a couple of times, but it destroyed the leader of our band and somebody who I was very close with. You can understand why I was not very interested in experimenting with that stuff and why it wasn't really for us, So yeah, I think there are a fair bit of musicians who people do perceive as being, quote unquote psychedelic, who weren't actually experimenting with the substances. And that, to me, that's a really interesting division by itself,
right.
Kind of the division between what you would call psychedelics and psychedelia, like the actual drugs, and then the artistic movement that they had an effect on. And psychedelia, the movement, wasn't always rooted in the drugs themselves. And I think that's important to recognize as well. And for this book, because the psychedelia movement is just enormous, like globally, not just in the United States, I kind of had to make the decision that I really wanted to focus on the psychedelics themselves and the effect of the drugs on the culture. And if I wound up sort of exploring these spaces where there are people who are creating psychedelic-influenced art without necessarily the psychedelics themselves, that the rule of thumb I made kind of put them a little bit outside the purview of this book.
Right. And some are going to say, not every generation, but certainly there are eras, and in the history of music, if you look at it from that point of view, there's always been a drug of choice, whether it was the early blues guys, everyone from Miles Davis and go on back way further than that, or heroin use, lots of marijuana use. You have the psychedelic group that was doing LSD. My guess is Beyonce doesn't drop acid. I'm just going to guess. I'm going to guess Justin Timberlake probably doesn't.
I'll go ahead and guess that too. But something that is interesting is that I have seen references to psychedelics coming back into pop music and coming really into hip hop for the first time that I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. A$AP Rocky has a song called LSD recently, and Miley Cyrus, who's known for being a big teen pop star, and maybe going off that track a little bit, but she's certainly been fairly pro psychedelic recently. So you're right in that not every scene is that, but I am interested in seeing the way that it does. Psychedelics kind of do make their way into unexpected places in surprising ways.
Right, but as the 70s kind of moved along, particularly starting in the middle 70s, I would think, the drug of choice became, especially as America started to realize, it's okay to make money again, and it's all right, and things like Studio 54 popped up. Now, all of a sudden, you've got cocaine everywhere, and some of the other ones, and ultimately ecstasy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so LSD sort of took a back seat, but like you said, particularly with a new group of younger people, part of that subculture that listens to the Grateful, that goes back and retroly listens to the Grateful Dead. They listen to bands like Widespread Panic and Fish and all these what are called jam bands, so to speak. If our listeners don't know necessarily all those different names. But it would seem to me those kind of psychedelic drugs are much more a part of that culture than some of the others.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I'd also add that they are still a huge part of dance culture. I mean, cocaine kind of took over disco in the late 70s and kind of the Studio 54 era, as you said. But going back before that, the party that people talked about that was the founding party of disco was called Love Saves the Day in New York, and which abbreviates to LSD. So there's always been this really strong psychedelic undercurrent in the dance world, and even in the 80s and 90s, kind of almost more in the UK than in the United States. That thread continued. There always was a psychedelic dance world. The mainstream probably, sort of bent in a different direction. But yeah, in the 80s and the 90s, kind of this jam band world sort of emerged out of the shadow of the Grateful Dead, and became kind of this sort of locus point for psychedelics in this country. There's now this huge, festival scene in the United States, like in a lot of ways grew out of the Dead world and the Fish world and the jam world. That has, it's not that every one of these festivals is, this big psychedelic orgy of Technicolor and LSD and all of that, but it is kind of become this ingrained American ritual that, it's riding the rails, it's hitchhiking, and it's taking LSD at a big summer concert, that kind of stuff. And I think that's become kind of its own distinct American tradition.
Well, the work is called Heads, a biography of psychedelic America. Heads, indeed. Jesse, I have to admit, I have not used that word in that context for quite a while. It sounds all right. It's not too bad. By Jesse Jarnow, he's a writer, prolific writer. Actually, writes for all kinds of different publications like the Village Voice, Rolling Stone, San Francisco Chronicle, and others. Jess, we kind of wind down here. Okay, so looking back on all of this, all the research, all the various things that you did, what's the headline coming out of this thing? What's the lesson out of this? Wrap it up for us in one sentence.
A look at how psychedelics shaped the United States. I think that's kind of what I was going for. I mean, I see psychedelics as this presence that kind of continues under the mainstream dialogue in the United States. I find it to be never very far from the surface in various ways. For example, just when we talk about Bitcoin, well, the way that Bitcoin got its popularity was through the Silk Road, which was a drug selling dark website. That was how this virtual currency suddenly became so extremely valuable, was because it was used in this this ongoing black market that's existed for the last 50 years in this country. And that's just one example. So I think that's really what I hope to do, is to kind of show that it's not just a 60s thing, to show that it's this continuous thread that continues to have a pretty regular impact in unexpected ways on the way we live in the United States.
Got it. Well, I really appreciate your time. Hey, how can people find out a little bit more about the writings that you do, plus also maybe pick up a copy of the book?
Sure. Well, I guess maybe the most direct way is to go to my website, which is jessejarnow.com. That's JESSEJARNOW.com. I also run an account on Twitter called Heads News, which is fairly easy to spell, which is I post updates on the book as well as kind of psychedelic news items and things that sort of grew out of my research.
Well, I really appreciate it, and look forward to maybe having you on again sometime, and just be careful. The brown acid is dangerous. The brown acid's dangerous out there, so be careful.
True. Thank you so much for having me. All the acid is potentially dangerous. That's the thing about it, but it's also potentially transformative. So there's,
man,